The objective of this module is to understand the various options available for extending the existing services of CRT, creating a new service, and configure them for the e-commerce storefront. We will discuss how to configure Commerce Runtime for your e-commerce site, review default services available in CRT, and identify how to extend the CRT services and CRT workflows. In this lesson, we'll learn about the different layers in Commerce Runtime, their purpose, and how they interact with each other. CRT database. The Microsoft Dynamics AX Commerce Runtime serves as the engine for a retail channel. It connects to a CRT database that stores business data for the channel. When you implement Microsoft Dynamics AX 2012 for retail, you create a database for each store location or online store. This database is called the channel database. A channel database holds only the data that is required for retail transactions. Let's talk about the data access layer. On top of the database is a data access layer. In the data access layer, raw data is translated into objects in memory. For example, an object could be a product. Products have attributes like price and color. The data access layer has functions you can use to manipulate these objects. Stored procedures pass packets of data from the database to data entities that can be used in services and workflow. You can update the packet of data to include new fields that you add in Microsoft Dynamics AX. Now let's talk about the services layer. On top of the data access layer is a services layer. Services query your real-time data. You can use the services to customize existing functionality or add your own service with new functionality. Now let's take a look at the workflow layer. On top of the services layer is the workflow layer. A workflow is a collection of services and business logic that together define the business process. For example, when a customer adds an item to the cart, you can use a workflow to get the price, perform validations, check inventory quantity, calculate shipping, calculate tax, and calculate discount. You can utilize workflows that are included in Microsoft Dynamics AX, or you can create a new workflow. You can even use a workflow to connect to a third-party system as part of your business process. Now let's talk about the API layer. On top of the workflow layer is the API layer. You can use the API for things like getting information about items, price calculation, shipping calculation, and placing order. You can extend the API to fit your business process. In this lesson, we'll learn about the default services that are provided with the Commerce solution. The following are the CRT services available out of the box. Address service. Address service can be used to verify address and get location information like cities, counties, or states. Charge service. Charge service can be used to calculate auto charges, price charges, and shipping charges for a transaction. Currency services. Currency services can be used to convert currencies based on exchange rates. Customer service can be used to maintain customer information. Dimension service enables customers to find items in your store based on criteria like category or color. Email services can be used to send email to customers. Loyalty service implements a program that rewards repeat customers. Payment service can be used to connect to third-party payment providers such as credit card processing. Pricing service obtains the price of an item in real time. Product availability service can be used to calculate the quantities of products that are available to sell. Rounding service can be used to round the tender amount. Sales order service can be used to create a sales order based on customer shopping cart. Shipping service can be used to calculate shipping costs and determine shipping options for the current order. Store locator service can be used to list the stores based on criteria like proximity and product availability. In this lesson, we'll learn how to create a new CRT service. The Commerce Runtime includes several services that represent particular areas of functionality for your online store. If one of these services does not meet the need of your store, you can create and completely replace it with your own service and continue to use the other services that are installed with the Commerce Runtime. This topic describes how to create a new service and add it to the Commerce Runtime configuration. A service handles any number of service messages. A service message is the combination of a service request and a response. To create a service, implement a request, a response, and a service. To create a service object, create a class that inherits from the service request class. Implement the service request constructor, and optionally implement any validation that you want to perform on the request. To create a response object, create an object that inherits from the service response class, and implement code to perform your desired functionality. Typically, this would be a get or set operation. To create a service object, create an object that implements the iService interface. Implement an execute method that takes a request object and returns a class that is a service response. Cache the request as type the service can handle. If the cache succeeds, call a method to perform an action. And finally, return a response. Services are enumerated as type in the Commerce Runtime config file. The Commerce Runtime config file controls which types to load. Services are loaded in the order in which they are listed in the configuration file. All of the default services are loaded automatically. But if you add a new service above one of the default services, the new service will replace the default service. To modify the configuration file, open commerce-runtime.config in your solution. Add a line to include your new service. You can also add a specific type in the configuration file. Now let's talk about CRT workflows. The Commerce Runtime includes workflow business logic that enforces rules for your business. For example, after a customer places an order, you can use workflow to make sure there is sufficient quantity available, validate the tax calculation, check for credit approval, and then place the order. You can use the workflow that are included in the Commerce Runtime or create your own. Just like services, workflow uses the request and response pattern. The request object inherits from the base Commerce Runtime request class. The response object inherits from the base Commerce Runtime response class. A workflow also has a request handler class that extends the workflow request handler. To create a workflow, you create a request class and a response class, and then create a request handler that contains the business logic for your workflow. To create a request, create a class that inherits from the base Commerce Runtime request class, and create any incoming parameters that you need for your workflow. To create a response object, create a class that inherits from the base Commerce Runtime response class, and implement code to perform the desired functionality. Typically, this would be a get or set operation. To create a request handler, create a class that inherits from the base Commerce Runtime workflow request handler class. Implement a process method that takes a request object and returns a response object. Cache the request as the type the workflow can handle. If the cache succeeds, call a method to perform an action, such as calling one or more CRT services. And finally, return a response. You cannot customize the workflow that is included with the CRT, but you can replace it with your own custom workflow, or you can add additional workflows. The CRT configuration file determines the workflow to load. If you add a new workflow with the same name as a default workflow above the default workflow, the new workflow replaces the default workflow. To modify the configuration file, open commerce-runtime.config in your solution. Add a line for a new workflow to the list of assemblies. In this lesson, we'll learn how to create a new CRT service. The Commerce Runtime includes several services that represent particular areas of functionality for your online store. If one of these services does not meet the need for your store, you can completely replace it with your own service and continue to use the other services that are installed with the Commerce Runtime. This topic describes how to create a new service and add it to the Commerce Runtime configuration. A service handles any number of service messages. A service message is the combination of a service request and response. To create a service, implement a request, a response, and a service. In this demo, we'll learn how to create a new CRT service and configure it. Let's start by going to the samples folder. When you install the Retail SDK, under the Documents library, the Retail SDK installs a sample for promotions. Let's go ahead and open the promotion solution using Visual Studio 2012. Within the solution, you can see two main projects, the service project and the workflow project. The service project is an example of a service implementation for CRT, and the workflow project is an example for a workflow for CRT. The service project contains a request, a response, and a service. Let's take a look at the service request. In here, they have implemented a get promotion service request. This derives from the default service request. The service request object can be used to define the data members for the service. Now let's take a look at the service response. The service response, in this case get promotion service response, implements the service response default object. In here, you can define the output for a service. For example, in this case, a list of promotion details is returned from the service. Now, let's take a look at the promotion service. The promotion service is implemented using the channel promotion service class, which inherits from the service object. The main method here is the execute request. This is where bulk of the business logic happens. In this case, the execute request retrieves a list of promotions and returns it as part of the service response. The workflow implementation is very similar to the service implementation. It has a request object and a response object. The difference is, instead of the service class, it has a workflow request handler. The workflow request handler, in this case the promotions workflow request handler, implements the default workflow request handler class. The main processing happens in the process method. For example, in this case, the process method calls the promotion service to fetch a list of promotions. Now let's take a look at how to configure the new service and the new workflow in your environment. The easiest way to do that is to go to IIS Manager, open a web application, and click on Explore. You can see the Commerce Runtime configuration file here. Let's go ahead and open that. In here, you can define the source assemblies and the source types you want to load. If you have a new service, you can add the source assembly for that here. And that's how you configure a new service in the Commerce Runtime. In this module, you learned about Commerce Runtime Engine and the various layers in Commerce Runtime, the default services that are provided with Commerce Runtime, creating a new CRT service, and creating a new CRT workflow. I'll see you in the next module where we'll talk about testing and deployment.